So I guess I want to talk about, a different form of visualization, an analog form in a lot of ways. The paper that I want to give is kind of an attempt to map out a larger project that I'm just trying to find entry points into at the moment. So the paper is called Illuminated Darkness, Nightmares, Blind Spots, and Biofeedback. I want to tell the beginning of a story, somewhat tenuous account of what might be called a manifest imagination. This is a story of how we are all already imaginary beings, entities not governed by the rules of science or truth or reason, but at least always in part by our imaginary participation in the formulation of the world. This is also the story of a digital imaginary, minds caught in the dynamic of user-generated content, bound by worldly context to something that would never have appeared to an analog mind, namely the observation that reflection is no longer the governing sign of knowledge or understanding. We pass through the mirror to the other side, and on the other side what we find is that the rules of the game have changed. Bodies and minds flipped from side to side, and the frame which housed reflections has also disappeared, absorbed into the world of screen-based living. We've become imaginary technological beings, a situation that has been described by many, from Paul Virilio's assertion that technology makes phantom limbs of bodies and minds, to Arthur Croker's insistence that technological citizens are possessed individuals, to Marshall McLuhan's suggestion that technological bodies are literally turned inside out. But there's another story that frames the situation more directly, Fauna of Mirrors, a tale by Jorge Luis Borges. In this story, the mirror people, once citizens of the same world as us, were banished to the other side of the mirror, the side without a frame, the side where the mirror lacks its reflective power, a one-way mirror that is also a screen. Who jumps first, the mirror or its reflection? Well, we give agency to ourselves, but what if we were crossed to this other side? Wouldn't it be just the opposite? Here we would no longer see ourselves in imitative gesture. Instead, we would see a self that mocks us, a master self staring vainly in our direction, not staring back, not responding in passive obedience, but compelling mimetic response. From the land of the screen, we jump second. Our appearance is always ahead of us at the speed of half distance traveled, the speed of light that only has to go half as far, the space of the light beam before it's reflected back. This is a place of light caught in mid-stride between illumination and appearance, light in transit, not illumination proper, but its unrealized potential. It's a distinction between reflected light and what photographers call incident light, direct light, such as that from the sun or a light bulb or a screen, light from which one measures fallout, a location in space rather than an image, assessing in this instance the level of general illumination present. Incident light is light on its way to an object, the light of vectors rather than positions, not yet reflected back into the realm of appearances, not yet bound to the story of light, but only to that of illuminated darkness. And just like in Borges' story, the mirror people, having understood their debt to the incident rather than reflection, have now slowly begun to re-infiltrate the world of flesh, threatening to reclaim in some way the imaginary agency stripped from them on the other side, re-emerging from the screen and re-infusing the material world with imaginary presences. And so in this spirit, the story that I want to tell today grows out of a meditation on the relationship between incidental light and the lights of the imaginary, both lights that do not reflect but project their images outwards, casting shadows, terrorizing established standards of illumination and exposure, morphing and deforming existent relationships that we thought were representational, and in so doing, burning their way with blinding intensity into real-world manifestation. This is a story of light that re-enters the world from the darkness, and a story of three incidents: nightmares, blind spots, and biofeedback, three cases of the body as technological generator of illuminated darkness. The first instance, the case of nightmares. A story such as this is only appropriately begun with a nightmare, a defiance of the impossibilities of daily living that forcibly infiltrates the minds of the dreamer. Spoken in a language that allows no denial, nightmares can be so terrifying only because they allow for no reciprocal engagement. Yet in this, in a strange and not so subtle way, one might conjecture that nightmares are proof of the power of imaginary being. Nighttime thoughts or fears that manifest with real-world impact. And because of this short circuit of the question of volitional imaginary engagement, one might go further and propose that nightmares can be seen as a shortcut to the possibilities of the imagination. A shortcut because nightmares cut out the question of intentionality in favor of subjection. No reflection, only unwanted exposure. Here, nightmares are a familiar, if less than desirable, manifestation of that which is beyond rational control, but which nevertheless seems to happen. Whether we believe the medieval stories of incubus possession, the psychoanalytic stories of unresolved life experience, or the scientific stories of random synaptic firing, is not irrelevant, but it doesn't affect the argument. Nightmares, even when we dismiss them as unimportant, have measurably real physiological effects. Seen technologically, the effects are even more real than the nightmare. Measurable and machine verifiable, even if their causality remains in the darkness of uncertainty. It might be as simple as increased heart and respiration rates, or as complex as moments of waking with a bloody nose, screaming or in continued panic, because even though we realize we're already awake, we're never quite convinced that the imaginary hasn't somehow followed us back into the waking world. And by most accounts, a large majority of us have had a nightmare or few of this sort, those dreams that plague the waking day and refuse to relinquish their nighttime hold over a day that is no less real for its irrational contingent. And it's important to note this dark side, this relationship of the nightmare to both the literal darkness of dreams and the figurative darkness of cognitive anxiety, if for no other reason than to immediately insist that an imagination of this sort can have real effects, and not always of the happy creative type. Here it strikes me that there's an important connection to be made between the nightmare as a cognitive and physiological manifestation and the type of metaphysical thinking described by Antonin Artaud as active metaphysics, a thinking that insults itself, that situates itself between gesture and thought, between dreams and events, and according to Artaud, as a literal form of incantation. The notion of thought as incantation is nothing if not a most literal description of nightmares, imagined encounters that nevertheless do not obey the boundaries between dreams and reality. This is to say not only that nightmares may have metaphysical importance, but also that they might provide an access point to the imagination through the power of metaphysical manifestation. And in this spirit of Artaud's active metaphysics, one might call nightmares a form of thinking in reverse, a metaphysical reverse engineering whose endgame is a flip of Nietzsche's declaration that we only remember what hurts, transformed here into a mnemonic device, a nihilist pedagogy of one sort or another. For Artaud understood as well as anyone that the powers of incantation and dream are neither reflective nor even yet relational, and the idea of allowing ourselves to be injured in a certain direction as metaphysical strategy ceases to lose its significance if such a willful cooperation also dulls the effect. This task of understanding, in other words, is not by any means one whose aim is a domestication of nightmares, but rather more strangely a simple awareness of the unwilled immediacy of encounter, what Peter Sloterdijk calls a critical proximity, as opposed to a critical distance from the question. And one might suggest that this proximity is exactly half the distance between criticality and this reflective self-awareness, an incident that manifests in the tongue-speak of nighttime incantation, actively preventing reflective distance through a demand for immediate encounter. And notably, the same strategy has a long history, albeit in a slightly different form, a form requested rather than demanded, a form in which proximity is a function of desire rather than forced encounter, namely the history of aesthetic discourse, where experiential proximity is the coveted modality of engagement. And whether the formulation is that of Aristotle's plausible impossibilities, or Kant's disinterested interest, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge's suspended disbelief, what each has in common is precisely not a distancing tactic, but a willful encounter grounded in the immediacy of imaginary engagement, without necessary regard to the reality or unreality of the situation, which is not to say without critical awareness of the state of affairs. And for each of these thinkers, Sloterdijk's critical proximity is central not only to the aesthetic experience, but to the cultivated integration of reality and the imaginative. Importantly, such integration begins not with sophisticated knowledge machines, but always with the language of encounter in its most basic form. For literature, poetry, for science, mathematics, maybe data even, and one might extrapolate for dreams, nightmares. And I raise these affinities to reinforce not only the manifest power of nightmare encounter, but also to firmly connect nightmares with a history of imaginary engagement, to connect aesthetics itself to a metaphysics of nightmares. In fact, the nightmare might even be seen as a form of meta-aesthetic, taking aesthetic strategy one step further into a suspension of reality, a form of the imaginary that dictates material proximity, or in other words, an unwilled aesthetic encounter. And this would make sense since nightmares do not respect the boundaries of possibility, reality, or sense, yet nevertheless impact upon the lived world. Here, the nightmare relationship, the suspension of disbelief, is one that is explicitly forced, a forced suspension to which one might even attribute a sort of perverse yet living poetic. Consider some of the most common nightmares, those where we're being hunted or chased but can't escape, those where we fall towards the ground on a crash course to daytime, those where our teeth fall out of our mouths, one by one, sometimes in mid-speech. Might these all not seem to be strangely aesthetic renderings? A poetic return to our own transgressed agency, paradoxically spoken through the very rupture of will into lingering real-world manifestation. One might not quite call this mind over matter, for it's difficult to assign the agency of these encounters to ourselves, but there's definitely a dynamic in play, a manifest context that can't be ignored, burning awareness into experience, emerging from the screen of the imaginary backwards into the world of flesh. Nightmares, then, as imagination burns, a first instance of illuminated darkness. Second instance, case of blind spots. The grounding of this exposition in a cultivation of nightmares serves two purposes. First, it reinforces the proximity of encounter, frustrating the attempt to establish a rhetorical or critical distance. And second, it provides a preliminary instance of our relationship to the manifest imaginary. In fact, the case of nightmares suggests that such a relationship is less something to develop, since it already exists, and more simply an imaginary fact of life. The problem being that the associated manifestations are imposed unwillingly, according to a schedule not of our making. Fortunately, a more accessible version of the phenomena exists, a daytime nightmare of sorts that can go unnoticed because it also goes precisely unseen. Here is a second instance of encounter. We might look at the blind spots of vision as a case of the manifest imaginary, intruding explicitly on the appearance of the world around us. A similar case of illuminated darkness, but one that offers different critical possibilities. In the simplest explicative iteration, blind spots are those areas of the eye where the optic nerve penetrates the retina, areas in the eye where there is exactly no sight present. But these blind spots do not manifest as such. Interestingly, in those areas where we are deprived of sight, we nevertheless experience visual stimuli. The blindness is sutured, the void is imagined in, the gap is filled. In some instances, it's a simple cross-pollination from one eye to the next. But even in instances where we see only with one eye, the mind refuses to leave that spot of sight unfilled. What would be darkness is lit up by the power of consciousness alone. Blind spots, in other words, are areas of illuminated darkness, in a literal way, proof that part of what we see as real is explicitly made up, hallucinated into being. One might even say that the blind spot is not so much simply a physiological exception or defect as it is an orifice, that from which the imaginary is excreted into the world at large, preserving a seamless vision of reality by masking the reality of vision. Suddenly out the window goes the reliable basis of knowledge as that which can be observed and through observation verified, and in its place rest those fictions which reciprocally fade into appearance as the false lights of imaginary presence. It's not quite quixotic, it's not as simple as a completely delusional world at large. It is instead deceptively Cheshire, a blind spot grin smiling back at us from every angle, a ubiquitous aesthetic protrusion with such proximity as to render itself invisible to the human gaze. Now, the irony of this formulation is that seen technologically, the blind spot reveals that eyes have only ever been partly about seeing. This can be made clear with a simple reference to Paul Virilio's vision machine, which makes the compelling case that eyes have been rendered technologically redundant, replaced by a digital gaze that sees more, better, and faster. And this is also the eye rendered then as what Jean Baudrillard calls the useless function, an eye replaced by its technological double that now forms the horizon of legitimate vision, human vision being relegated to the status of second-class organic. In Baudrillard's words, when the world or reality finds its artificial equivalent in the virtual, it becomes useless. A prophecy that fulfills Virilio's promise of machinic vision. And yet, there are ghosts in this machine, that which remains to take aesthetic revenge when the full spectrum illumination of a digital gaze mistakes the world for a seamless visual entity. The eye seen technologically emphasizes the simple fact that what technology does not, and perhaps cannot replace, are exactly the defects of sight, the aspects of vision that have always been there, but which we're just only beginning to see. In short, the part of the eye that is physiologically responsible, not for the reflective rendering of an apparent and verifiable world, but for the guardianship of imaginary protrusion. Technology may render the eyes blind, but if so, we are left with what amounts to a blind spot imperative of sight turned useless. The assertion that vision has always been a guardian of this imaginary function of useless practice. Interestingly, the eye scene technologically reclaims a physiological importance by exactly embracing a nightmare of blindness. Now, this is obviously in part conceptual abstraction, but I want to take it one step further. For this dynamic is not limited to the eye. It also has a cognitive equivalent. The useless functions are also those that, in Baudrillard's words, have somehow forgotten to die, left to aesthetically roam the world with a value-added suspension of science and truth, returning to wreak an imaginary revenge on the world and its appearances. The real effaced by its double is a potentially dangerous ghost, says Baudrillard. And under the sign of the useless function, the directionality of the blind spot begins to reverse. Not merely a suturing of reality, nor simply an imaginary vision that fills in sight where there was none before, but strangely one that begins to replace certain aspects of apparent reality. It's not as strange as it sounds. For example, in a recent issue of Scientific American, the neuropsychologist V.S. Ramachandran speaks of a phenomenon called inattentional blindness, a case of not seeing things that are actually right in front of one's eyes. Ramachandran describes the study like this. Pretend you are the member of an audience watching several people dribbling and passing a basketball amongst themselves. Your job is to count the number of times each player makes a pass to another person during a 60-second period. You find you need to concentrate because the ball is flying so quickly. Then someone dressed in a gorilla suit ambles across the floor. He walks through the players, turns to face the viewers, thumps his chest, and leaves. Astonishingly, 50% of people fail to notice the gorilla. Interestingly, under conditions such as this, it seems that the blind spot returns with a strange reversibility, not filling in a vacant spot of vision, but explicitly imagining away the disruption. Not the technological disabling of vision, but the cognitive augmentation of appearances. A strategic displacement of reality into the blind spots of vision and cognition. This epiphany is, of course, an apophany, a false versioning of reality that is nevertheless faithful to the human tropes of vision, even an imaginary particle stuck in the eye of the vision machine. And if there was any doubt that the blind spot might be seen as an orifice for the protrusion of the imaginary, this should at least cast some illuminated doubt on the question. Blind spots, then, as an orifice of the imaginary, a second instance of illuminated darkness. The third instance, in the case of biofeedback. At the midway point between nightmares and blind spots, in the dialogic space between imagination burns and the revenge of the imaginary on a world of technological vision, a fissure begins to appear, one that speaks of feedback possibilities for a world imagined differently. It's a place where Pavlov's dog begins to chase the Cheshire cat, a place of potential promises for imaginary conditions and imaginary conditioning. The game is one of cultivating nightmares and putting things in the blind spot of cognition, not idly, but as a strategic response to the aesthetic proximity of the world. The simple version of this incident, the case of biofeedback, goes back to the technological status of contemporary bodies, what Virilio describes as phantom limbs of a world gone virtual. At stake in this formulation is first and foremost its use of nightmare terminology to describe a human state, the traumatic immediacy of amputated bodies held out as the version of how we should all now self-conceive. And while there may be an injustice done to the question of real pain and violence in such a description, we might nevertheless conjecture that Virilio means this quite seriously as the current state of technological living, a system where sensation is an artificial dry heave of bodies rendered useless. Strangely, however, we're still compelled to reconcile this state of phantom sensation, physical or technological or both, registrations of injury in parts of our bodies that are simply no longer effectively present. No more eyes, now only the hallucinations of phantom vision. No more hands, only the paradoxes of phantom touch. No more minds, now only the delirium of phantom logic. In other words, if we've become the phantom prostheses of a virtual world, what do we do with our residual phantom sensations? If we follow the model of the nightmare, we might begin by insisting that even though these sensations no longer belong to a phenomenal reality, they nevertheless continue to have phenomenal effects. If we follow the model of the blind spot, we might continue and ask whether such sensations are not themselves symptoms of imaginary extrusion, suggesting not simply the ghostly lingering of bodies rendered useless, but the concomitant presence of manifest imaginary of one sort or another. Interestingly, the clinical assessment of phantom limbs corresponds very closely to both of these assertions, particularly in an experiment conducted, again, by V.S. Ramachandran. According to Ramachandran, after amputation of an arm, the vast majority of patients continue to feel vividly the presence of the missing arm, a condition that sometimes includes feelings of phantom pain. To treat this pain, mirrors are used to present the image of a limb where there is none, effectively fooling the eye, and through the eye fooling the mind as well, into a sympathetic response. It doesn't matter that the patient knows he or she is being fooled. The visual stimulus is sufficient in most cases to alleviate the pain, at least temporarily. In Ramachandran's words, I quote, "If information from vision and touch are incompatible, visual dominance may cause us to actually feel things differently than if we relied only on touch," a sensory hierarchy that his experiments exploit for medical and psychological purposes. Now, I want to suggest that this system is one of imaginary solutions, a term coined by Alfred Jarry when describing the science of pataphysics. And I want to make this attribution because what Ramachandran refers to as a process of tricking the mind into accepting the truth of a situation might just as easily be excerpted from this system of truth and looked at as a more general process for the reconfiguration of subjective awareness. In this instance, what I'm suggesting is that outside of its clinical application, where the process has a direct and articulated objective, there's a more general rule to be learned about refashioning cognition in the imaginary. And within the frame of this more general view, there's no good reason why this structure shouldn't be reversible. And so here there emerges really an important rhetorical question. If we didn't have phantom sensations, could we make some up? By all accounts, we may already do so, if the cases of nightmares and blind spots are any indication, or if Aurelio's technological assertions are correct. But there are also other examples. Psychosomatic diseases imagined into existence, even psychosomatic cures, sometimes placebo-induced, sometimes credited to the pure power of will. And what are we to gain from this if not an indication that the manifest imaginary is potentially malleable in certain directions, or within certain parameters? The question, consequently, is not so much if one can cultivate such a response, but how. This is where the field of biofeedback offers some interesting possibilities. Phantom sensations conditioned into manifest reality. Imagine, for instance, that thinking warm thoughts on a cold day might actually serve to improve finger and hand performance as you work outdoors. It's not exactly a phantom limb, but perhaps a phantom glove on a limb that's already there, an imaginary overlay to an otherwise frigid reality. It's also a biofeedback conditioning study, one of many that might serve as further instances to explore, this time conducted by psychologist Alan Hiebert in the 1980s, in which participants were placed in a sub-zero environment and asked to imagine themselves warmer. With practice, some classical Pavlovian-style conditioning, and a bit of studied instruction, these participants were able to increase the temperature of their hands by 16%. And this is important not because it optimizes cold weather performance, but because it's symptomatic of an imaginary impact on real-world physiology. A daytime nightmare in which the physical sensation of coldness is strategically placed into the blind spot of cognition, and ironically into the blind spot of the measuring machines as well. Here the real-world cold is conditioned out of manifestation, supplanted by the imaginary version of warmer weather activity. Biofeedback then is a cultivation of imaginary solutions, a third instance of illuminated darkness. And so to end, just to say, if we're to take the imagination seriously, then it seems, in fact, each of us no longer lives really in the story of Borges' mirror, but in that of another Argentinian writer, Adolfo Bioy Casares, whose story, The Invention of Morel, takes the tale of the mirror one step further. This is the story of a reality machine, in which the central character confronts precisely a world of the same kind as that in which we live. A world where machinic simulations walk and talk and set the dominant narratives of the everyday. A world where the simulation dictates reality, and any attempt to hold on to the paradox of a real simulation simply means confrontation with walls that were not there 2 minutes ago. And a world where the imagination bleeds, not because of a sympathetic affect response, but because it's made of flesh and blood, because it gets lonely when not engaged. And rather than be ignored, Casares' protagonist embarks on an elaborate scheme to insert himself into the simulation. Archived while still alive, biology's fed back to the imaginary systems that surround them. In short, here in the shadows of Morel's invention, we find ourselves as generators of imagined realities that are strangely no less real for their imaginary depth. And for those who pretend that the imagination serves reality, it must be insisted that in reality, it's exactly the other way around. And like with each of the examples invoked here, there's a more general rule that begins to congeal, a reversibility of terms that suggests that imaginary solutions are not bound in any necessary way to performance deliverables, but only to the proximity of practiced interaction. The imagination is that which manifests, as nightmares and thought as incantation, as blind spots and useless functions, as biofeedback in imaginary solutions. And whatever one calls it, the imagination is not quite under our control, but it's not exempt from control either. It is instead, in some ambiguous but potentially realizable way, relational, defying will but responding to a proximity of encounter, defying reflection but responding to incidents, defying the light of technological day but responding to engagement with illuminated darkness.